chatting. Cool. Done and done. And my great passion when I was in school is evolutionary psychology. When I first got to college, first evolutionary psychology lecture that I attended opened my eyes to pretty much... It's the window to how to understand everything about life. Everything about psychology. Most psychology is done painfully theory-free. And this amounts to a lot... Well, I guess it just amounts to little more than people taking guesses. People offering explanations for things that couldn't possibly be true. And people pushing their own personal beliefs because they don't know how to actually ask questions and do research. And there are lots of these disparate fields from economics and anthropology and sociology and psychology, and they're not really talking to each other, and it's a fucking mess. And evolutionary psychology really opened my eyes to this. So today, we're going to go ahead and we're going to do this. And I'm going to share this all with you. And depending on how these go, we'll do more of these. We'll see how many, how in-depth, how often. But for now, I want to start off with this here quote from, I believe Dobzhansky is how you'd pronounce that last name, where he says, "Nothing in biology makes sense except in the light of evolution." And this is not an understatement. What we're aiming to do today, really, starting today anyway, is to explain the behavior of all living organisms, both human and non-human. Everything. And this seems simple enough, right? We want to explain literally all the behavior, and to the extent that we can ask about psychology, all the psychological functions of every living thing that is and has been. That's the importance, really, of what we're setting out to do today. And what we're going to start out today with is setting the groundwork for everything that's going to come in as broad and efficient a sense as possible. I don't want you to leave today with the sense that I'm going to tell you everything there is to know about evolution. I won't. This is just a solid foundation from which we can start, and I'm not going to bog you down with every minor detail as much as we can. What we're trying to establish is a unified theory that explains the behavior not just of people in some unique way, apart from other animals, because the same process that gave rise to human psychology and behavior, accordingly, also gave rise to other species. And because of this, we should expect by humans to play by pretty much the same theoretical rules as everything else in life when it comes to understanding behavior. Which is another issue I've always had with a lot of psychology research. It's very extremely human-centric. And these psychologists would be more or less at a loss in trying to explain why a pig behaves the way it does, and a fly, or a moth, or a tapeworm, or a virus, or any of it. Their theory doesn't cover non-humans, and their theory doesn't even cover humans well. But after all here, since our behavior is generated by our nervous systems, which are fundamentally biological in nature, and the behavior of other species is generated by their nervous systems, which is biological nature, and the same process gives rise to all the same of all biology, all of it, across humans and non-humans, the psychology of all living things is best understood through this evolutionary lens that we're going to look at today. And I have to do this a little manually, but that's all right. So the field of evolutionary psychology, then, in its simplest form, is just the application of evolutionary theory to understanding psychology. Evolutionary theory, well established, well demonstrated, and used to understand life in all of its forms. Unfortunately, when it comes to psychology, a lot of people start with evolution, and they believe it right up until the neck. If you go below the neck, they believe in evolution. And a lot of psychologists, if you go above the neck, they forget evolution exists. Which is kind of regrettable. Because the more we understand the process of evolution that gives rise to our psychology, as well, again, as the psychology of pretty much every other species, and the behavior, accordingly, of every other species, we're far better positioned to understand why psychology looks the way it does. Why do living things behave the way they do? And the same principles can guide our answers to questions like, why do birds sing? Why do people buy designer clothes? Why do infectious agents like bacteria and viruses, sometimes they debilitate a host with crippling illnesses that might kill them? Other times, the infection is so mild and dormant in the host that you might not even realize they have any infection present at all. And this can also help you understand a lot of things that we take for granted as a natural part of life. They're actually rather strange, rather complex, and require deep explanations. Like why you might be interested in watching a stream or listening to me. This might feel very normal, but it's actually a rather peculiar behavior that requires special understanding to fully explain. And similarly, there are other parts of life that are going to seem extremely bizarre, extremely hard to understand from our perspectives. But once you actually apply evolutionary theory to them, not only do they become simpler, but you also begin to find out that these strange behaviors, these things that are difficult to explain, actually rather similar to the things we do. Because again, we're all playing by the same rules, we're all formed by the same processes, and so there's a lot of underlying similarities there. So I want to stress up front here, first and most importantly, is that what I'm going to be providing you is an approach to understanding psychology and behavior. You can think of this as a method just for thinking about things, a lens through which to view a topic, a framework that you can use to better structure your knowledge about psychology and behavior in general. Evolutionary theory is really incredible in its organizational power here to help us understand not just about things we already know, things we already observe, things we already experience. Not only does it help us understand and explain them, but evolutionary theory is also going to help you understand how to ask questions about things that we haven't even yet observed. It's going to give you the ability to look in the right places and form the right questions to really further your understanding of bits of our psychology, of our biology we might not even be aware of really yet, and why we might see them in other species as well. Because after all, really, if you're looking to find the right answers, it's extremely useful to know what the right questions are to ask in the first place. A lot of people will ask the wrong question and they'll spend years, decades, a lifetime trying to find the answer to a question that was just poorly formed to begin with. And evolution, the application of this theory can really help narrow down a series of questions we ask to the most useful and most informative ones that are likely to provide the best answers. And so that's really one of the major values of this approach, is that it's going to help people, whether you're a researcher or whether you're not, as many of you are not, ask the right questions about psychology. Because if you're asking the wrong questions, ones that don't even make any sense in the first place, you're going to end up pursuing answers that don't exist, you're going to mislead yourself and others, you're going to waste a lot of time. And in fact, really, it's not uncommon in my experience of reading the psychological literature over the years that authors will regularly, not uncommonly, regularly pose explanations for their findings, which are in the best of terms incomplete, and in the worst of terms, they're impossible. They're trying to explain things in an incomplete way, in an impossible way, sometimes just in a circular way. They don't actually know, as strange as this might sound, how to explain things properly. They do not know what a proper explanation for their behavior even looks like. And so they start spinning a bunch of tales about why people do what they do, which are fundamentally incompatible or not informed by the process that shaped all these behaviors to begin with. And this is really no different at all than someone trying to explain behavior or psychology in a way that would violate basic rules of physics and chemistry. They're proposing something that's actually impossible. And as such, because this is a framework that we're talking about, this is an approach to asking questions, I don't really want you to come away from these lessons with the idea that the evolutionary approach is tied in any way to any specific finding, to any specific paper we're eventually going to discuss. In science, just as in all areas of life, people are going to be wrong. And they're going to be wrong kind of a lot. I'm wrong all the time. You're wrong all the time. Everyone is wrong all the time. And people who are using this evolutionary approach to generate questions and hypotheses and look for behaviors and try and explain things, they're going to be wrong too. Everyone's going to be wrong occasionally, usually a lot. But really, the evolutionary approach is just, it's useful for guiding our search for knowledge. It's useful at guiding our formation of hypotheses. It gives us the ability to ask better questions. It doesn't mean we're always going to get the right answer, like how the scientific method doesn't always give you the right answer to the question. It's just the best method that we have for gaining knowledge. This is much the similar way. Because someone misapplies scientific theory or does an experiment that doesn't work out, it doesn't mean the scientific method sucks. So evolutionary findings, like all findings, are going to occasionally be wrong. It doesn't mean the evolutionary approach is wrong. It just means that some hypotheses didn't work out. Some findings don't hold up. This is totally normal. Messing up, in other words, is a very human trait. And similarly, we're social creatures, and as such, even correct findings, replicable findings, well-understood findings, are still going to be misrepresented in all manner of forums, from news articles, online discussions. It's not really uncommon where you see those sensational headlines about science says this. Despite the fact that science is a method, science doesn't say anything. It's not a result. Evolutionary psychology, the approach is a method. It's not a result. Same thing here. We just want to use this to help understand human psychology, not tie the approach to any one particular finding. And I want you to bear that just in mind for life in general, but for all these lessons in particular. Because I've also heard many ridiculous, evolutionarily informed explanations for things that just didn't make any sense because the researcher was not well informed themselves. It's a human thing, not so much a theory thing. So of course here, we can't talk about applying evolutionary theory to anything without first making sure we actually understand what evolution is in the first place. And so with that in mind, it's time really to take our first steps forward here and talk very broadly about what evolutionary theory itself is. And on that front, we're actually very lucky because evolutionary theory is itself an incredibly simple process. On its core level, evolution is made up of, spoiler, 3 points, just 3. And we already accept most of these points. The goal of evolutionary theory originally was to explain all the variation we see in life and all the functionality we see in life under one single unified theory. All of life, as I mentioned before, everything. So why are there so many variations of living things that exist in the world? How and why did these living variations come to be the way they are? And evolution here is a framework for understanding how life changed and continues to change over time, why it takes the various specific forms it does, why it looks the way it does, and ultimately why does it behave the way it does. What evolutionary theory is not, though, is a theory about how life began in the first place. That's a totally separate matter. The term for that is abiogenesis. How does life begin from non-life? Evolutionary theory just applies once life already exists. It's about how life changes and how it comes to take the form that it does after it's already here. So there are 3 general points that make up an evolutionary process. Evolution by natural selection is the full term for it. And you're likely familiar with all 3 of these points already. Even if you aren't explicitly aware that this is how they're structured, you already accept every one of these 3 tenets of evolutionary theory. So that's really good news for us, because all I have to do right now is help you organize a little bit of your knowledge, and because you already know it, you'll already understand evolutionary theory. It's very intuitive. once you actually spell it out. And it actually, once you do spell it out, it becomes rather remarkable to think that for however many thousands of years, people never fully grasped it. So the first point about evolutionary theory, the first of these 3 points that makes it up, is what you see right on the screen right now. It's variation. We're intimately familiar with variation. Life varies quite a lot in all of its forms. We have life that's quite small. There's the mouse here that we see in the elephant, of course. Large difference between them. Life, of course, gets way smaller than mice. There are bacteria, for instance, one of the very smallest living organisms we're aware of, which tend to be about 5 to 10 microns long. A micron is about 1/1,000,000th of a meter. So we're talking about 5/1,000,000ths of a meter in terms of its overall size. By comparison, the mouse is actually tremendous. And then we also have life that's quite large, like, say, a blue whale. Largest living animal, I believe, on the planet right now. These reach about 30 meters in length. So you start out with a bacteria about 5/1,000,000ths of a meter to 30 meters. That's quite a lot of variation. And of course, there's a lot more than just size. We have some animals that are covered in hair, some more densely covered than others. Other animals are covered in feathers. Some living things are covered in bark. Other living things covered in scales. Humans, we walk around on 2 legs. A lot of other animals use 4. Some living things use dozens of legs. Others, like plants, don't move at all. Some snakes, they don't have any legs to speak of. Some of these living things will subsist eating on basically one specific type of food. I believe koalas almost exclusively eat, say, eucalyptus leaves, whereas other species like humans or bears eat a much larger variety of things, from a variety of meats and a variety of plant species. Other living things don't really eat so much at all, as much as they absorb some nutrients from the ground and photosynthesize the rest from light. But the point largely that I want you to bear in mind here is that wherever you look in the natural world, in the biological world, you're going to see variation between species like this. Tons of variations across tons of different factors. You're also going to see this variation within species, not just between them. Even though all humans tend to be quite similar to each other, at least compared to how similar we are to other species, not all members of a species are in any sense exactly the same. Some are larger or smaller than others. Some are faster or slower. Some are better at remembering certain things. Some are more fearful. Some are more aggressive. So some of these also might have different internal features that you don't even directly observe. So I might make slightly different shaped proteins internally than someone else. And these proteins can affect the way that my body functions and is capable of behaving. So life is varying both between species and within species in a nearly endless number of ways. Could be minor, could be major, could be observable, could be a lot more difficult to observe. But this is the first point about evolution. This is the first point you have to bear in mind. Variation exists. It exists between species and it exists within species on pretty much anything you can imagine. It's not just the easily observable parts, it's all of it. So we got variation down. The second component of an evolutionary process is inheritance. So there's some of this variation that we observe that's capable of being passed on from a parent to an offspring during reproduction. Again, something we are all aware of intimately. Humans give birth to other humans. We don't give birth to cats. We don't give birth to birds. We don't give birth to bacteria. Humans give birth to humans. Cats give birth to cats. Ducks give birth to ducks. Well, birth is a weird word, but they create more of them. And further, the offspring that get produced tend to resemble their parents more than other random members of the species. Taller parents will tend to produce taller offspring, while shorter parents will tend to produce shorter offspring. Whenever any of this variation we observe is capable of being replicated from one generation to the next, usually, in this case, through passing down of shared genetics, we have inheritance. Now, importantly, there's also variation that's incapable of being passed down from one generation to the next. And this variation does not impact the evolutionary process. For instance, if we have two genetically identical organisms that differ in size, because when one was growing up it had ample access to nutrients, and while the other was growing up it just didn't have enough food, it didn't grow quite as large. These differences in size, this variation would not be capable of being passed to the next generation. Similarly, if you were to lose an arm during your lifetime, say in a car accident, the loss of this arm, while it is variation that exists, is not variation that's actually capable of being passed on to your offspring. So it's only the variation that is inherited that plays a role in the evolutionary process. And this is the shared genetics that get passed down from one generation to the next. So we're already mostly done with evolutionary theory. We have variation and we have inheritance. Organisms differ from one another, and some of those differences are capable of being inherited by the offspring they produce. So this brings us very nicely to the final feature of an evolutionary process, which is differential reproduction, or you could call it selection. Not all of these inherited variations are going to be equally good at producing more copies of themselves and getting into the future generations, given all the challenges associated with reproduction. As we can see from the little bird here, if the bird, for instance, is better at spotting and eating these green beetles might be less likely to reproduce and pass themselves on to future generations than the brown beetles. And so if the brown and the green traits are capable of being inherited, one variation might be selected for and reproduce more readily. So some of this inherited variation is just going to be easier at reproducing itself than others. And those that are better at reproducing themselves become more common in future generations, while those that are worse at reproducing themselves become less common and eventually can disappear entirely. And the reason this differential reproduction exists is because there are heavy constraints on reproduction. Life just can't reproduce endlessly, and we can look at a very quick example to understand why. Let's return to a bacteria, which we can see here from our previous example that we talked about. So the bacteria, as we covered, about 5 millionths of a meter long. So let's say you had one single one of these bacteria, and you allowed it to reproduce endlessly. And the way this works is every 24 hours, the bacteria, it reproduces asexually, so it just splits in half. There was one bacteria, after 24 hours, you have two genetically identical bacteria. After 48 hours, another 24 pass, those two both divide. And so now you have 4 bacteria. So then on day 1, then you start with 1 bacteria. Day 2, you have 2. Day 3, you have 4. On day 4, we end up with 8. On day 5, we end up with 16, and so on down the line. What would happen over time if we left this process to go unconstrained? I did some rough math on this, and I did a quick Googling of something, and assuming I did this properly, after 30 days, we end up with about 500 million bacteria. A week later, that number jumps to 69 billion. A week after that, we're at about 8.8 trillion. If you go out to the 60-day mark, we end up with a number of bacteria I can't pronounce because I've never actually encountered this number before, but it's the number 6 followed by about 17 zeros. So let me see, that's hundreds, thousands, millions, billions, trillions. I guess like 600,000 trillion bacteria, whatever that number is. And if you expanded this process out for a full year, again, starting with 1 bacteria, dividing in half every 24 hours, you end up with the number 4 followed by 109 zeros. And to give you a sense as for the scale of what I'm talking about here, how large that number is, if the quick online estimate search I did was accurate, that would be more bacteria than there are atoms in the known universe by a lot. In fact, I think it would be more bacteria than the number of atoms in in a billion trillion known universes. So again, one bacteria splitting in half every 24 hours, in 365 days, you end up with far more bacteria than there are atoms in the universe. Needless to say, our universe is not entirely filled up with life. So something about this math clearly isn't working out. There are constraints on reproduction. Rather heavy constraints, actually, because life isn't really even getting that far off the crust of this planet, let alone expanding fully into every possible corner of the known universe. So the ability to which an organism's inherited variations help it solve problems associated with reproducing successfully is going to determine which of those variations are making it into future generations. That's where the selection part comes in. And that is effectively evolution in a nutshell. We should also already be very intimately familiar with this process of evolution, since we have used it as a species for our advantage for centuries. Ever since we really began domesticating plants and animals, we have been using evolutionary theory intuitively to do things with them. For instance, what you see on the screen here, this is corn. On the left, closest to me, this is the wild type of corn. On the right is the corn that has resulted from years of humans effectively, genetically engineering corn, just through selectively breeding it. Humans have been selectively breeding species like these for generations to make them produce things that are more useful to us, like in the case of food, in the case of corn, tomatoes, watermelon. Any plant or animal that we eat has been heavily, artificially bred by humans to be far better at producing the things that we value. And other times, we just selectively breed things because we find it funny or charming. And this is no more evident than the abundance of dog breeds that we have today. Every dog breed that we have today is descended from a common species. And we've just bred them for a variety of different sizes, of different traits, of different looks, hair types, behaviors. We have been selectively breeding dogs and food and animals for generations. And this type of human-generated selection is usually referred to as artificial selection because it mimics natural selection. The only difference is that humans are consciously guiding what we want to see more of, as opposed to the natural selection pressures from life causing things like this to happen. Now, it's worth mentioning at this point that you've probably heard of evolution phrased as survival of the fittest. That's probably what comes to most people's minds when they hear the word evolution. And so this quick overview we just did of the evolutionary theory helps you understand why that's not exactly an accurate characterization of the evolutionary process. Evolution is not about survival per se. It's not about surviving at all, really. It's about the reproduction of inherited variations. Variation, inheritance, differential reproduction. That's evolution. Evolution, again, is the reproduction of inherited variations. Survival is only useful to an evolutionary process in as much as being alive helps you reproduce. But if you were the healthiest person that's ever lived, the fittest person that ever lived, you survived to be 1,000 years old, and you were smart, and you were fast, and you were creative, and everyone loved you, but you produced no offspring, none of those variations that made you live long and be fit would be represented in future generations. By contrast, if you have some irresponsible teen and they die when they're just hitting their 20s, but they leave behind 3 children, those inherited variations would represent an impact on the evolutionary process, whereas your variations would simply disappear. Surviving is not the key to understanding evolution. You have to understand it's about reproduction. Evolution, since people are mentioning idiocracy, evolution does not always favor the fastest or the smartest. It favors those things that reproduce. And more importantly, it's about immediate reproduction. Which variations are reproducing right now? That's what the evolutionary process is about. But there we have evolutionary theory in its condensed form. A differential reproduction of inherited variations. You now understand evolutionary theory on a very broad level. Organisms vary from one another. We all know this. And those variations are sometimes passed down from generation to generation. We know this. And not all of them are equally good at reproducing themselves. If you can accept those 3 facts and tie it together, you have successfully understood the evolutionary process. It's a very simple process. Your offspring look like you. Not everyone has the same number of offspring. So while it's incredibly simple here, the implications of this theory are massive. They allow us to take entirely different perspectives on why life exists and changes as it does. The variations that exist today exist largely because they were better at solving problems related, however distantly related, to reproduction. They solved those problems better than their competition did. And these problems that are related to reproduction, we call these adaptive problems, because they're the things that caused the variation in the world to adapt their shape to provide solutions to these problems over time. Adaptations are the outcome of solving adaptive problems. Again, adaptive problems being those related to reproduction. What do you have to do before you successfully reproduce? And how are you doing those things better than your competition? So for these reasons, the features of living things appear to have very functional designs. Even though they weren't consciously designed to do anything, they weren't engineered, they were shaped by natural forces, they do seem to have functional designs. Eyes are incredibly complex mechanisms that have a particular function. Bones are complex mechanisms that have functions. Beaks, feet, hands, fur, behaviors, all of it. It's very complex. And it's very functional. And that's because you need to solve problems to reproduce. And if you're not solving those problems effectively, you're going to be out-reproduced by those that do. Now, there are a few quick additional points here to make about evolutionary theory. Clear up some common misconceptions that people might have about this before we move forward. The first of these is that evolutionary processes only work on variations that improve current reproductive success. It's about immediate reproduction. In other words, what I mean here is that evolution cannot favor some variation that might be useful in the future generations. In order for it to be selected for, it has to improve reproduction right now. Has to be useful right now. Every step of this evolutionary process needs to produce immediate reproductive advantages to pass itself on. In other words, evolution just doesn't have any foresight. It's just looking at, are you solving problems now? Are you better at reproducing right now? So you can't go from an organism, say, that has no eyes to one that has an eye without each step of that intermediate process of shaping the organ of the eye. Every step has to be useful in some capacity. If you're going from no wing to a wing, every step of that evolutionary process has to provide immediate beneficial reproductive advantage. And sometimes that can be a rather complex process. How do you go from having no wing to half a wing to a full wing if that half a wing doesn't provide the abilities that a full wing does? And I'm not going to get into the details of exactly how that works right now, other than to say the eventual function of something that we see today, an eye or a wing, that might not have been the past function for which it was selected for. So a wing might have started as something that solves an entirely different adaptive problem, but later, after certain stages had been passed, modified its function to do something else. And so a wing might originally not have been for flight. Wings could have done something else, or the early precursors of wings could have done something else. Second thing, a second misconception to clear up is that evolutionary processes do not always produce optimal outcomes here. Evolution can only operate on existing variations. And what variations exist will determine what eventually evolves. And the things that eventually evolve might not provide an optimal solution to some adaptive problem, let alone produce the best solution to a current problem. Because evolution is all about what reproduced in the past. What was a good fit for solving adaptive problems in the past? Well, if environments today are different from environments in the past, the adaptations that we have might not have optimized themselves for this current environment. Evolution doesn't always provide optimal solutions. The adaptations that we have merely represent the best available solutions to those problems that happen to have reproduced. And they also may represent compromises between competing demands. So let's say, for example, you're very fearful of being eaten by predators. This is a real evolutionary pressure because if you get eaten by a predator, you probably can't reproduce anymore. So we want to solve the problem of being eaten by predators. So we might produce some adaptations for detecting predators, but we're not always going to detect every possible predator because we don't have the information available to do that all the time. These adaptations are not going to perfectly detect every predator. They're just going to do better than their competition. Further, let's say you have an adaptation to avoid predators. In this case, you crawl into a hole and you freeze in fear. Because if you're in this hole and you're not moving, it's very hard for predators to find you. Congratulations, you're probably not going to get eaten. You are solving this adaptive problem of predation. But an animal that was so frozen in fear probably wouldn't be able to carry out other tasks of life. Things that are important, like foraging for food, finding a mate in the first place. There are compromises between solving these different adaptive problems. And the optimal solution for avoiding predators is not the same optimal solution as finding food or finding mates. And so there's a push and pull between different selection pressures that drive you towards different solutions. Like if you wanted to, let's say, reduce car fatalities, car accidents. If you make everyone drive 5 miles an hour in a completely armored, padded Jeep, pretty much no one is going to die from car accidents. But the solution to this is so ridiculously inefficient that it starts getting in the way of other things. And so evolution doesn't always produce optimal outcomes, it just produces the best that it can do. And finally, I want to bear in mind that an evolutionary process doesn't imply any type of deterministic behavior, free from environmental inputs. Some people will refer to this as genetic determinism, that because this is in your genetic code, you are guaranteed to do this all the time. And evolution is not about inflexible behavior, quite the opposite, actually. Evolutionary theory is about adapting and changing. It's not about rigid, inflexible behavioral patterns. Every adaptation that we have needs to interact with environmental inputs to develop and function. It's the environments that determine what's adaptive in the first place. And any organisms that don't respond to these environmental inputs would quickly find themselves at a disadvantage. And a great example here would be calluses, as you can see pictured here. I have calluses on my hand because I go to the gym. There's little tough bits of skin that will form the more friction you repeatedly apply to them. Because I go to the gym and I grab these heavy, rough iron weights, and I hold them and I lift them and I move them repeatedly, my skin toughens in response to these repeated inputs. Now, the ability to form calluses itself is an adaptation. The ability to do this is somewhere in our genetic material. But before we can form calluses, we require important environmental inputs. And we're going to see it in the coming weeks that this is the same for other psychological adaptations as well. You're going to require certain environmental inputs to trigger the development and functioning of key psychological mechanisms and generate certain behaviors. But suffice to say for now, nothing about this evolutionary process or the presence of adaptations suggests that a behavior is going to become fixed or unchangeable. Modifications to our physiology and our behavior happen all the time in response to environmental inputs. So, when you want to understand why living things look the way they do, why they behave the way they do, any complete explanation of this requires us to delve into their biological function. That is, we want to start asking questions about what problems related to reproduction did this feature solve? How does this feature solve those problems related to reproduction? And an evolutionary approach to answering these questions, the application of this evolutionary theory is very much a functional approach. We want to know about the function of biology. What does it do and why does it do it? And knowing about a function, whether it's of biology or of a man-made device, helps you understand its component parts and behaviors far better, and it can even help you predict the presence of features that you haven't observed. So to fully appreciate this point, there are many examples we could consult. And this one here is always one of my favorites because I read about it in a book and I was confused when I first saw this, and then they explained it and it all made sense. This is the value of a functional approach. So this thing, what you're looking at the screen right now, probably unfamiliar to most of you. So we're going to start from this point of ignorance. You know nothing about this device. And we are trying to understand it and explain it. So if I showed you this thing, and I asked you to study it and tell me about it, just from this picture, you're probably not going to get very far. And this is what modern psychology largely is without evolutionary theory. They don't have a functional mindset. They don't understand why things are the way they are. And so it's like trying to describe this device without understanding its function, really. You can tell me about its color, its shape, maybe take a guess as to what material it's made of, but it would remain a strange device broadly. So to start making some progress on understanding this, you start taking a functional approach. You might note, hey, there are some spikes over here. I kind of know what spikes might do. This is a crank. I think I know what a crank does. This turns. Spikes poke. Okay, maybe this does something with poking and turning. And you might also start thinking about, okay, well, what am I poking? What am I turning? So I'm going to spoil the mystery here. This is an apple peeler. And all of a sudden, that starts making a lot more sense once you know this is an apple peeler, doesn't it? Use the spikes here. Well, you stab an apple on it. The spikes hold the apple in place. The crank here is going to turn the apple in a circle. And we can also guess as to some things we haven't yet observed. Well, if this is an apple peeler, if this is for peeling apples, there's probably a blade here. And indeed, this little doohickey right here, this will shave the skin off the apple. And though you might not see it right here, this little circular bit, this will core the apple. So as you turn the crank, you push the apple forward, this pulls the skin off as it rotates in a circle, and then this cuts the core out, and you are left with a cored, peeled apple at the end. Once you understand the function of the device, all of a sudden, the parts you're looking at instantly start making more sense. And you can even start predicting the presence of things that you haven't understood yet. That there's a blade here, there are sharp components. And you also might predict, well, if this is an apple peeler, if I stick an egg in there, it's probably not going to work as well. If I stick a potato in there, maybe it will take some of the skin off the potato, but I don't need to core a potato. So the little circular bit that's by the spikes, those don't need to exist. That'd be very strange if this was a device for peeling potatoes. It makes a lot more sense in the context of an apple, given the size of the apple and the demands of peeling the apple. So this type of functional intuition, this functional thinking, informs us not just about man-made devices, but also about biology. So if you're examining the typical human body, you're going to see that it's composed of all these different component parts. Well, what do all these different component parts do? What function related to successful reproduction are these components solving? What are they doing? What adaptive problems are they solving? So there's a heart there. Well, what's the heart for? Some people might say, oh, the heart, it generates emotions. I love you with all of my heart. I have a broken heart. I feel so sad. Well, if you're trying to understand the heart as an emotion generation device, you're going to misunderstand the heart. You're going to pursue bad questions related to the heart. You're going to conduct a lot of bad research related to the heart because you have the wrong functional mindset for what the heart does. The heart is a pump. It's there to help circulate the blood around the body. Once you understand what the heart does, you can do a lot more useful research about the heart. And I know that might sound weird to us today because everyone knows the heart pumps blood. But we didn't always know that. That's why there are phrases about broken hearts and loving you with all of my heart. People have thought before that the heart is generating emotion. Now, it doesn't. It's related to emotions because the function of the heart may change with different emotional states. Well, not the function, but the state of the heart is going to change with different functional states. But once you know the heart's a pump, you understand a lot more about the body. Our lungs function as gas exchangers. The blood in our body is a transportation mechanism, which is also working in tandem with the heart. Heart moves the blood around the body, and it's working in tandem with the lungs. The blood is getting oxygenated by the blood. The lungs are oxygenating the blood, and the blood is dropping off certain waste products that the lungs are then going to exhale. And then the blood is going to bring all these nutrients and other things to different tissues in the body. Our teeth, our stomach, our intestines, these all function to help digest food, extract nutrients from it, nutrients then circulated by the blood, by the heart, and so on. And related to all this blood, we got livers, we got kidneys, we got filtration systems for clearing things out of the blood, removing waste products. Understanding the function, the biological function of these devices gets us a really long way to more profitably understanding the body that we're living in. And without an understanding of what functions these different body parts are achieving, what adaptive problems they have evolved to solve, we'd be largely clueless about how our body would work, and medical knowledge would be lacking. Remember, some people used to get sick, and the remedy for sickness was to drain their blood. Bloodletting. That was a common medical practice. because they didn't understand the mechanism by which infections work. Similar, if you have anything else about a body or a device, if you don't understand how the thing works, what function it's serving, you're going to come up with all sorts of weird explanations for it and do a bunch of weird things that are at best useless and at worst extremely harmful. So the basic tenets of the evolutionary approach to psychology, then, is that much like there is a universal human body, lungs, heart, kidneys, liver, different functions, but all the pieces generally there in everyone's body, there's also a universal human psychology, a human nature that's been shaped by an evolutionary process. Meaning that our biology is adapted to the regularities of our past environments, as is our mind. What you're seeing here, by the way, this is not necessarily a complete dissection of, but a general dissection of the human nervous system. To the extent there is a you in your body somewhere, this is what that is. Now we're going to get in the next lecture to whether or not there actually is a you in your body. Spoiler, there isn't. But this is the brain, this is the nervous system, this is the thing that's generating every perception, every feeling, every behavior that we've ever had. This is your psychology. It's just the biology of your psychology. And this biology that makes your psychology is adapted and evolved in exactly the same way as the rest of your body is. So just like we have eyes, hearts, lungs, blood, skin, digestive tracts, so too do we have different pieces of our psychology that do different things. And it's a relatively universal human psychology. And the psychology, much like the rest of our body, is made up of lots of different pieces. Evolved psychological mechanisms that process specific types of information and generate specific behaviors. They take in certain inputs, they spit out certain outputs. Same way your heart is a pump, different parts of your brain do different things, just related to thoughts and behaviors. And there's a lot of good reasons for these similarities too. This universal human nature, this universal dog nature, or wolf nature, or bacteria nature. There's all these similarities across species and how they behave and how they look and what they're made of. There are very, very good reasons for these similarities within and between species. Here we see a bunch of different eyes. There's a good reason a lot of species have eyes, even if the specific eye they have isn't always the same. And the reason, of course, for these similarities is that on a very basic level, there are far, far more ways of being dead than there are of being alive. So we can start by thinking more first about the body below the neck, in this case. So in order to be alive, to continue to be alive, a lot has to go right. And if any aspects of your biology fail, and they're not functioning properly, you often stop being alive. There are a lot of pieces that have to work together, and if they fail, if any of them fail, they all fail, and you die. So if you're missing a heart, blood isn't circulating in your body, and you die. This is the reason a lot of species have hearts, even if the specific heart of that species isn't the same as the heart of every other species. You're also going to die if your heart exists, but it's not structurally sound enough to pump the blood around your body. It has to constantly be pumping this, and if your heart isn't up for the challenge, well, then you're going to die. Many more ways of being dead than alive. If you don't have lungs, lack of breathing, lack of respiration, well, that's going to kill you. Similarly, if you have lungs that don't function well, and you do not continue to repeatedly solve this adaptive problem, same outcome. You die. We have relatively universal bodies in no small part because the jobs that the bodies need to solve to stay alive and reproduce are all quite similar. We have universal bodies because we have to solve the same problems. If you're missing something, if it's not functioning properly, well, that variation probably not going to be very good at reproducing itself because it's going to die. The whole system will fail. So now let's move above the neck and let's talk about behavior. Because the same thing works for behavior too. Our psychology, broadly speaking, the function of our psychology is to generate behavior. To do things, physically move and do things. And if you don't want to be alive, in fact, there's a very simple remedy for this problem. The solution is to quite literally do nothing. Just do nothing. If you do nothing, you stop generating behaviors, you will end up dead in short order. Just like if you don't have a heart or you don't have lungs. If you do nothing, just stand there, you're going to die. It could be because you're exposed to the elements and those kill you. You're going to starve. You can dehydrate and just die. You can get eaten. Various parasites and predators come around. Any number of things in the world are going to disrupt your internal biological processes that you need to be alive if you just sit there and do nothing. There are many more ways of being dead than there are of being alive. That goes for behavior as well as physiology. But even if you are behaving, even if you're not doing nothing, there are still many more ways of doing things that are going to lead to you dying than being alive. You can eat the wrong thing, poison yourself. Or you can just fail to find the right thing to eat. You end up eating something that your body can't extract nutrients from, and you're going to starve. Even though you're putting like dirt and gravel in your mouth, your body can't do anything with the dirt and the gravel, and you're going to die. There's far more stuff in the world you shouldn't eat than there are things that you should. You might move around the world incorrectly. You might step off a cliff, fall down. You could die from the fall, or you could just die from the damage the fall inflicts on your body. You can end up approaching a predator that you should be avoiding, or failing to notice a predator that you should be avoiding. And then it eats you. And that's just thinking about dying, which, of course, is very bad for reproduction usually. But there are also ways that you might stay alive and do things which are evolutionarily useless, more or less. So in this new context we have, a thing which is evolutionarily useless is something that's not helping you solve these adaptive problems related to reproduction. They don't aid in you generating behaviors that are associated with reproducing successfully. And so the cognitive mechanisms that are generating those behaviors could fail to be adaptive. So, as an example here, maybe you fail to find the right thing sexually attractive. You end up sexually attracted to trees. Well, even if you're pretty good at staying alive, it doesn't much matter, because if you're sexually attracted to trees, you're going to spend a lot of time not reproducing. You're not going to generate the proper behavior to solve this adaptive problem. And if you look around the world, there are a nearly limitless number of things you could, in theory, be sexually attracted to. But only a very small number of those things are actually going to provide you with reproductive success. Far more ways of behaving inappropriately than behaving appropriately. So, let's say, like, you even managed to find the right species attractive. You're off trees now. You understand that human beings are supposed to be attractive, but not all of them for you. If you don't find the right members of your species attractive, you're also not going to reproduce very well. So, I don't know, if somebody is too young or too old, they're not going to be reproductively viable. Someone is the incorrect sex, they're not going to be reproductively viable. Someone is infertile, they're not going to be reproductively viable. And even if someone is reproductively viable, are they going to provide your offspring with the best genetics they could to continue on in future generations? There are far more ways of picking the wrong thing to be attracted to than there are of the right things. So just like there are far more ways of being dead than there are of being alive, far more ways of generating inappropriate behavior than appropriate behavior. And we need to solve these problems with our psychology just as much as we need to solve the problems of our hearts beating and our lungs exchanging gases and our livers and our kidneys filtering out our blood. We need the same physiology to stay alive, and we generally need the same psychology to solve the problems of life, to generate evolutionarily useful adaptive behavior. So many more ways of being dead than being alive, many more ways of not solving adaptive problems than solving them. And because of this, we tend to have universal human bodies, and we tend to have universal human psychologies. It's the exact same principles that hold in both domains. Now, I'm sure some of you, when you hear me say this, are immediately thinking to yourself, but wait a minute. Don't people do things all the time that aren't adaptive? Like, all the time? What about people who take birth control? What about people who spend all their time playing video games and watching TV? How do these behaviors assist people in reproducing? Shouldn't we just be basically trying to mate, hump each other all the time? And if you're thinking something like that, don't worry, because there are many such examples that we're going to be diving deeper in to understand them better. We're going to get to that in time. But that you're thinking about these things at all at this point is something I would be pretty happy with. Because if you're thinking about these things, you're really taking your first steps towards using this evolutionary approach to understand human behavior. You're thinking about what functions these behaviors might have. Are they solving adaptive problems? If they are, how are they doing it? If they're not, why are they failing to? If you're starting to think about adaptive function, even in this rudimentary way, that's great. And we can answer those questions in time. But this is what I mentioned before when I said some things that seem perfectly normal to people actually require very deep, detailed explanations. It might feel totally normal to be entertained by a video game. But from an evolutionary perspective, that requires a deeper analysis than just it's fun. It's fun is not an explanation. Why is it fun? What mechanisms are drawn to this? What is the adaptive function of those mechanisms? Are these mechanisms functioning properly given a modern environment, or are they more tuned to solving problems from previous environments? These are questions that we're going to have to start thinking about, and these are the ways we're going to start thinking about them. So in starting this journey, now that we better understand the evolutionary process in general and the value of this functional approach of thinking about what is the adaptive function of this mechanism, what has it evolved to do, we can take a quick step back and consider the three things that fall out of an evolutionary process. There are three distinct products of an evolutionary process. And these are adaptations, byproducts, and noise, random variation. So starting with adaptations first, these are the features of an organism that have become more common over time. These are the features that have been selected for by an evolutionary process because they've successfully solved problems related to reproduction. Individuals that have these traits tended to leave more offspring than those that didn't. And so we're going to use a little bit of a running example here, and we're going to talk about bones. Our skeletal system exists, and a skeletal system exists indeed for many, many different organisms, as an adaptation for solving certain problems related to bodily structure. So these skeletal systems assist us in moving around the world. They provide firm anchors for various bodily tissues. They allow us to use lots of behaviors, like you can open your jaw and close it to chew. You can use the firm bones in your hand that provide structure to grasp objects. In your legs to walk. If you're a fish, you can use your bones to swim. Or if you're a bird, you can use your bones to fly. And the bones also can serve as protection for various body parts. such as how we have a rather thick skull, because the brain is a very important organ. The body has gone through extra lengths to protect the brain, because when the brain gets damaged, you tend to be in a lot of trouble. The skeleton itself appears to be an adaptive trait. It's assisting in solving some rather important adaptive problems. And as such, we can see that some features of the skeletal systems are going to be related to the function they serve. The hardness and the rigidity of our bones is an adaptive solution to some of these problems. But sometimes these problems manifest themselves in different ways in different species that are facing somewhat different adaptive problems. So for example here, the adaptive problems of flight in birds are quite a bit different from the adaptive problems of walking, running, or swimming. And for this reason, the bones of birds, which you can see on the right-hand side, tend to differ from the bones of most mammals. An example you can see on the left-hand side. That is, the bird bones on the right, they're relatively hollow. They have these internal struts, and they're also denser. And this is related to the problems of solving flight. They're rather good at doing those things. Birds also in their skeletons, they have a fused collarbone. Also, I believe because of how muscles and wings have to attach. I believe that's what we'd call the wishbone, memory serves. But the skeletons of these birds, the bones of these birds, are adapted to solve specific problems, whereas the bones of, say, humans are adaptive to solve different types of problems. And because we face different adaptive problems, the function and structure of these bones has to change a little bit. And also, while we're thinking about skeletons, by the way, this is a very interesting thing to help understand our similarity with the rest of life. The skeletal system itself, the skeletal bones, are actually laid out in remarkably similar fashions between species. Now, the size, length, size, mass of these bones is going to vary from one species to the next, but the bones in your hand are actually the same bones found in the fins of a whale or the wings of a bat. It's all the same skeletal structure. It's just been stretched and bent and twisted in various ways. Because we face different problems. Could be swimming, could be walking, could be grasping, could be flying, could be swimming. I said swimming. But you get the idea. That these adaptive problems vary, and so the skeletal structure varies with them. The skeleton is an adaptation, and also the different forms of the skeleton have been adapted to solve these different problems. So this is really what an adaptation is. It's a heritable trait, one that's capable of being passed down across generations from parents to offspring, that's aided in solving some adaptive problems related to reproduction, and it's going to reliably develop. So skeletal systems are capable of being passed down in generations. They solve adaptive problems related to structure and protection, and they reliably develop in every member of the species, effectively every member of the species. That's the first product of an evolutionary process, an adaptation. Also worth mentioning, adaptations don't necessarily need to be present at birth. So for instance, humans have adaptations for learning and producing language, but babies are not born knowing how to speak. Some adaptations are going to require time to grow and develop. Even the baby's skull, when human babies are first born, their skulls are softer and not fully fused because this is related to the active problem of fitting a rather large body and rather large head through a rather narrow birth canal. The head can bend and reshape itself. And over time, another adaptation is going to fuse that skull together and going to make it more rigid. And some cultures, rare as they are, actually took advantage of this, and they can reshape the heads of adult members by shaping the heads of babies. And then they harden and become rigid in different shapes. Kind of gnarly, but some people do it. All right, so that's the first product of an evolutionary process, an adaptation, something that solved a reproductive problem that is inherited and reliably develops. But that's not all the evolutionary process produces. The second output is what we call the byproduct. A byproduct is a trait that results from the existence of an adaptation, but it is not itself adaptive. If we're going to stick with bones here, we've seen some functions that the bones serve, but despite being very consistently white across species, this whiteness, this color of the bones, doesn't appear to be an adaptation.
No refunds!
Instead, the whiteness of the bones is primarily more the result of the materials that the bones are primarily composed of. In this case, calcium and phosphorus. Makes the bones look white. It's composed of these materials because their strength helps the adaptation form, their rigidity and their toughness. But the color of the bones is a byproduct. It just comes along for the ride, so to speak. The two traits are tied together, whiteness and rigidity, say, but only part of that is the adaptive function. The rigidity is solving problems, the color of the bones is not. Another example that we might actually look at here are belly buttons. A belly button is effectively a scar that develops on every living human being because that's where the umbilical cord attached to the fetus as it was developing. When you're born, they clip it off, it falls off. The belly button is the scar that's left behind. The belly button is a byproduct. It doesn't serve a function. It's not like you store things in your belly button. It doesn't help you find food. It doesn't help you find mates or any of this. It's just there. It's present in all species, or rather all mammalian species. It's present on all humans. But that's not because it was passed down that we need belly buttons. It was just a byproduct of fetal development, of an umbilical cord attachment. And this also brings us to the third product of an evolutionary process. So we got adaptations, in this case, let's say the umbilical cord and fetal development. We got the byproduct, which is the belly button. And then we got the third outcome of a process of natural selection, which is noise or random variation. So some of us might have an innie belly button. Some of us might have an outie belly button. Our belly button might have a different shape. Yours or mine don't necessarily look identical. This is just random variation. The shape is not really a byproduct so much as it's just how things panned out. So while we all have bones, let's say, which are an adaptation, all these bones are white, which is a byproduct. Some of the bones, maybe of individual members, differ in some various ways for noise. You could have a novel variation that causes one of your bones to be a little bumpier, or one of your bones to be a little longer or shorter. Could be a novel mutation that causes that. Maybe like you have like a bump in your skull, a small bump. It's not an adaptation. It's not a byproduct. It's just you developed that way because something happened during your development at some point that caused a little reaction and now you have a bump on your skull. Sometimes there's just some random variation that happens because of environmental disturbances. You get a bump on the head, you fall and you break your arm. There's variation there. But it's just random noise. Not an adaptation, not a byproduct. So every trait that we observe in the biological world then, we want to try and classify as, is this an adaptation? Is this a byproduct? Or is this just noise? Is it just random variation? Because not every feature of an organism is an adaptation. And it's no simple matter to identify which parts of us are adapted and which parts of us aren't. And that's just talking about our body. This is going to get a lot harder when it comes to our brain and our psychology. Because we want to know, well, we have psychological mechanisms that are generating behaviors. Which of these behaviors are adaptive? Which are byproducts? How does human behavior vary along these same classifications too? And in trying to classify, is this an adaptation, is it a byproduct, or is it just random variation, there are some guiding principles. So the first is that adaptations are traits that have persisted because they've solved adaptive problems better than their competition. And the important tense here is in the past. It's in solved. Because adaptations are tied to past environments rather than present ones. Adaptations didn't make their way into the present generation necessarily by solving present problems. They made their way here by solving the problems of past generations. You know, they're the ones that actually reproduced and made the things that are alive today. In fact, interesting enough to think about, we're all the products of an unbroken line of reproduction leading all the way back to the origin of life. From the moment there was the first living thing that reproduced, everything alive today, it's an unbroken chain of reproduction up until this point. And the problems that were solved along the way are the ones that make up the adaptations you have. They're not there for the problems you're solving now. They're there for the problems that were there in the past. And because this evolutionary process is a slow one, the problems that our adaptations solve can often be quite old. And not only old, but they had to be consistently present and reliably present enough to be selected for those traits. So in thinking about what adaptations exist and what their functions are, we always want to be thinking about what problems were reliably present in past environments and how those affected reproductive success, and what environmental factors were important for the adaptations then, not so much now. For example, if we're thinking about the ability to see. Humans have this ability, many other species do. It relies on cognitively processing certain inputs of wavelengths of light. Certain wavelengths of light spectrum allow us to see when processed in particular ways. So this must mean that the presence of light was a recurrent feature of previous environments over time. And these wavelengths of light must have carried useful information capable of guiding our behaviors in ways that were reproductively relevant. You have to be thinking about, well, light must have been present in the past because we have these adaptations for processing light now. So you always want to be thinking about the previous environments. And you also want to be thinking about the functional organization. Adaptations are always functionally organized around solving problems. And there should be a very close match between the properties of an adaptation and the problems it was designed to solve. So adaptations, these are typically complex in their structure. They are unlikely to have arisen as a byproduct. Bones are complex in their structure. The whiteness of the bone is not complex. So the bone starts looking more like an adaptation. The whiteness starts looking more like a byproduct. You can explain the whiteness just as a passive byproduct of other features. You can't really explain the formation of a skeleton on the basis of, oh, this just happened to show up in the organism. So it's complex in its structure. They solve adaptive problems efficiently, reliably, and with precision. Bones do things reliably, efficiently, whereas the whiteness of the bones does not do things reliably and efficiently. And if we were to perhaps go back to our example of vision here, our eyes are incredibly complex in their design and extremely unlikely to have risen just as a random variation or a byproduct of another trait. They're too complex. They contain several features that are well suited for solving problems, like collecting light from the environment and adjusting their size and their look to more accurately respond to this information they're collecting. The problems that they're solving must have been consistently present throughout human history. There was always visible light we could have extracted. If there wasn't visible light in the past, well, then there's no point in having an eye that's particularly good at extracting it. And solving this problem must have affected reproduction. That is, things that were blind probably reproduced less well than things that weren't blind. We also see eyes reliably develop in populations all around the world. And so this really makes them very prime candidates for being considered adaptations. They're complex. They show up everywhere. They work off information that was present in our evolutionary history. They solve reproductively relevant problems. And I want to jump a little bit ahead here, very briefly, into the psychological aspect here. Because you might not appreciate this, but eyes are actually psychological organs. They are information collection organs. And this information they collect from the outside world has to be processed by very many specialized cognitive mechanisms in our brain to be useful for us. And vision is no simple problem. Just ask anyone that's trying to develop a self-driving car. Vision is an incredibly difficult problem to solve. And I mentioned earlier why some things that seem very natural to us require very deep explanations and a very deep understanding of the mechanisms that make up these adaptations. Even though it seems totally normal to us, eyes are a great example here. Let's just think about vision for a second. Although it really doesn't take much conscious effort to see, you just open your eyes and you're seeing. Seeing just happens when you open your eyes. Think about the suite of cognitive mechanisms that we need here. So we have to get the input of light. We have to get light from the world into our brains somehow. And then we need to do things like produce perceptions of color, perceptions of shape. How far away are things? Distances. We need to classify, is this moving? Or is this movement, or is it a different object? The same object that's moving, or a new object in different places. We need to classify this incoming light as this is an object, and this object is a living thing or a non-living thing. Okay, this is a living thing. What type of living thing is this? That living thing is a human. Which human is it? That human is my mother. What's my mother doing? She looks upset. Well, now I'm going to take this information that I see this thing in the world, which is far away from me, and this thing is an object, and this object is alive, and this living thing is a human, and this human is my mother, and this mother looks upset. And now I'm going to use all those outputs that I generated, and those are going to be inputs for other systems, such as emotional systems or motivational systems that generate behavior, regulate my emotions, send chemical and electrical cascades through your body to make you feel a certain way, to move your body towards your mother, to generate speech, to ask what's wrong, and so on. The number of cognitive mechanisms that are going on here, I'd probably to scratch the surface on this, it's massive. But because it's so well adapted to the environment, it is effortless. You open your eyes and all of this stuff just happens. You see, you classify, you react to, you respond, you move, all based on wavelengths of light that are entering your eye. And all of this is happening so quickly and with such efficiency and such precision that we don't think about it. But there are so many mechanisms going on there, and that's basically what our evolutionary psychology approach is trying to solve. The visual system here is telling us a lot about the mind. Our brain is adapted in the same way the rest of our body. We have all these different mechanisms in our brain. And we can learn a lot about the rest of our brain from understanding these about vision. If our visual system works this way, made up of all these component parts, well, what else is kicking around in our head? And likewise, we can also think about our psychology from past environments using evidence from lots of other different lines of research. So you can look at archaeological records. As it turns out, when you find human skeletons, male skeletons in particular, there tend to be more cuts, scrapes, fractures, dents on the left side of male skeletons. And this suggests perhaps a recurrent feature of our past environment, mainly facing a lot of right-handed attackers. We have cross-cultural research that we can lean on to think about the brain. We have a great capacity for learning language that reliably develops in human cultures across the world. At very similar ages, and interestingly enough, we'll cover this later, it also turns off very consistently at certain ages. You know how you learn to speak the language you speak right now, natively? Pretty much no effort required at all. No conscious effort that you can remember. No one sat you down and taught you how to do language. You just were around other people speaking, and you learned how to speak. Try to do that as an adult in a different language. If you're a native English speaker, move to France. Just be around people who are speaking French. See how much French you pick up. The answer, probably none. Because the adaptation for learning language at that point has turned off. And that capacity is gone. There's also genetic research that we can look into. Identical twins tend to be more similar in many features than, say, just regular siblings. And siblings tend to be more similar in pretty much every feature than children who were adopted but raised in the same home. We can look at cross-species research, not just cross-cultural, but cross-species. So why do males in lots of species tend to be larger than females? Well, a larger size between the sexes, a sex difference in size, wouldn't exist if the sexes weren't behaving differently. And sexes can't behave differently if they don't have different cognitive adaptations. And we can also, interestingly, figure out, once you know what the function is behind that sex difference, once you know why it exists, you can also understand the species not only in which it doesn't exist, when males and females are about the same size, but you can actually understand why it flips sometimes, and what factors determine why sometimes females are larger than males. And as it turns out, there's a very consistent reason for this across all different species. But the size difference, importantly, corresponds to a behavioral difference. And a behavioral difference indicates the presence of different psychological adaptations. And so all these different lines of research all of a sudden start converging once you have evolutionary theory. Now you can start looking cross-species. You can look cross-culturally. You can look archaeologically. You can look in all these different fields of human study, economics, sociology, psychology, and start tying everything together on the exact same principles. And it turns out the reason, perhaps, that humans like designer clothes is actually not only found in many other species, but extremely common. And it works for the exact same reasons, in the exact same logic, in the exact same ways. So the questions that we're going to start asking with this evolutionary theory is, why is the mind shaped the way it is? How is it designed? What mechanisms or component parts do our brains contain? Like our body contains livers, kidneys, lungs, heart, etc. Well, what are our mental organs? How many of them are there? What are their functions? What are the different parts of our mind evolved to do? What features recurrently in the environment have we responded to that were reproductively relevant? How does this whole process work? And once we understand that, how do we take inputs from the current environment and how are they interacting with the component parts of our brain to produce the behavior we see today? And importantly, as I've been really hammering home, this isn't just, evolutionary psychology is not just about humans. It's a perspective that helps us understand the minds and behaviors of birds, of insects, mammals, reptiles, even bacteria and viruses. You can understand their behavior through the exact same framework as well. All life on the planet was shaped by this process. It all plays by the same rules, and as a result, it all tends to produce predictable and understandable outcomes. And that's where we're going to leave it for our first lecture of the series. So now you have a pretty good grasp, I would hope, on the basics of evolutionary theory. And then from here, we're going to move into exploring more about the mind. And then we're going to start going, once we understand the general structure of the mind and why it works the way it does, we can move into more specific topics. Things like, why do people take birth control? And importantly, why do people oppose other people taking birth control? What about homosexuality? Why do people like designer clothes? What types of decisions are made when you're selecting mates? What about violence? Why is one of the leading causes of homicide a minor insult? Why are people willing to kill over apparently so little? And we can understand how this is going to work through a variety of different lines of evidence across species and from within our own and across the globe. I'm also going to go ahead and post all these notes. I'll make a new channel in the Discord. and I will post all of our lecture notes up in the Discord. So if you want to go back and watch the VOD, you can. I'm going to try and clip this for a YouTube video. And if you want to do the faster route and go and read it, I will post the notes there as well. Seem good? That's the thing about the unbroken chain of ancestors, something used in the past on a dude who was like 45-year-old virgin trying to date and find a wife. You can't fail now. Every male ancestor you have is going to fall back to the dawn. Every ancestor you had going back to the dawn of time pulled it off. Interesting thing about that, by the way. This is going to sound very strange when I say this, but I believe the estimate I heard is you have about twice as many female ancestors than you do male ancestors in the human species. Males reproduce a lot differently than females. You can start thinking about the implications of this, but a human woman can reproduce about once every, let's say, 1 to 3 years, based on whether they're breastfeeding or not, starting sometime, I think, around age 15-ish till about 45. There's like a 30-year window in there where you're gonna produce a maximum of, say, 10 to 30 offspring. A man, on the other hand, I think one of the most prolific male father figures that's ever existed, documented anyway. We got like Genghis Khan, some other guy whose name I forget. I think his nickname was the Bloodthirsty. They can produce hundreds of offspring. And there are so many implications that fall out of this for our psychology and our behavior. So anyway, that's that. I'm going to take a rest and get some lunch. And we're going to do the next lecture week or 2 weeks, depending on how long it takes me to get this all prepped up and what my schedule looks like. For now, looks like Fino's still streaming. So I'm going to send you over there. And until I catch you guys tomorrow, have a great rest of your day. Stay safe, stay healthy, have a good one, everyone. And I'll catch you all real soon.
Dead.